All right, so these little flowers are, they're just the simplest little shape, right? Just it's the most simple, basic flower shape you can get. But it took me forever to figure out what I wanted to do on these. And honestly, I probably tried and ripped out more things on these flowers than I did on the whole rest of the hoop. I would try something and I'd think it was going to work and then it didn't work and I ripped it out probably 6 times. But I am finally happy with what I decided on. And it's not anything earth shattering or, you know, extravagant, but, these are kind of small areas, so there's that to take into consideration. But anyway, I wanted to have a little bit of texture. So the first thing I'm going to do is satin stitch the petals, and I'm using 3 strands of the DMC. And I could have used 1 strand for this. I could have used 2, and that would have maybe given them a slightly smoother, more delicate effect. But I kind of wanted them to be a little bit chunkier, a little bit more texture. But if you would prefer to have them be even a little bit smoother, then you can absolutely use 1 or 2 strands for this. And because we are working on flower petals and in an arc, like we've talked about before, you are going to need to do a little bit of that satin stitching in an arc where you, like that stitch, you know how you don't go quite as far in and you tuck it slightly under the stitch in front of it or before it, the previous stitch. So that's what I did there to make these stitches go around that arced shape of this petal. And we're not doing any outline stitching before. We're not going to stitch over an outline because we're going to be outlining this afterwards. So you do not have to be just really precious. Well, that one went a little wonky, but it's all right. It'll be covered up. You don't have to be super precious about your edges. Either this outline here, this edge, or this interior edge, because both of those are going to be covered up. The outside edge we're going to put an outline around, and the inside center edge we're going to be covering up with a real textural stitch. You can see it right here. I mean, you don't want it to be the edges to be too messy, but it's not like it's going to be a satin stitch where the outside edge is going to be seen. So that's all there is to the petals. Just really your basic satin stitching in an arc with 3 strands. In keeping with the sort of idea of the whole rest of the hoop where I'm blending a lot of colors, I didn't want these petals to just be one solid color. So I am adding a little bit of another color on the inside ring, and now I'm using 2 strands. And although I guess this is thread painting, it's not like the real intense thread painting that we were doing earlier. I'm not using 1 strand for everything, and I'm not trying to, especially with this second color, I'm not trying to cover completely. I really just want to get some, I just think of them as rays of color right on the inside ring of this flower. And that pretty yellow just blends in with this really interesting pink. Same sort of technique though. I'm coming up inside the stitching and then going down. But that's just a quick little step, and I think it really adds a lot of interest with that other second color on top of the petal color. One of the sections that gave me the most trouble when I was trying to figure out what to do on this flower is this little center section. And I had a whole different plan for the center, and it just wasn't working. And so then I realized, okay, I want to have a blue ring around it, but I want it to be 3-dimensional. And there's a couple of different ways to get a 3-dimensional, ring around something or a stitch. And then I remembered that we had done the the ruffled edge on the viola leaf, and so I wanted to do the same thing here. But whereas on the viola leaf we stitched a row of chain stitches in which to do our buttonhole stitching, for this I really just need one stitch in order to do the buttonhole. You know, on the other one, we wanted that, you know, when you do a chain stitch, you've got two stitches and you leave one showing and then you buttonhole through the other. This one, I don't need a stitch showing because I'm going to cover it up anyway, cover up the center section. So what I'm doing is I'm just stitching straight stitches around, and depending on the side, like this one, I only stitched 4 straight stitches because it's a smaller circle. And this one is a smaller circle. This one may only get 4. I don't know, or I might just make that circle bigger. That one, I can make that circle bigger, I think, when I stitch it. But this one has enough room to do 5 straight stitches. I'm using 3 strands. Just a simple back stitch. It doesn't matter how you get these stitches in here. Just get some stitches in. Oops, sorry. All right, so there's my stitches. And you know, they're not all the same length. This one ended up being quite a bit shorter, which is not great. I wish it was a little bit longer. I could have made it longer, I guess, but you know, it is what it is. So anyway, now that we have our straight stitches in, these will be what we make our buttonhole stitch. So now that we have our straight stitches, these will be what we will stitch into for the buttonhole stitch. And you know, just like the scalloped edge on the leaf, the viola leaf earlier. So I'm going to come up. I always like to work with the stitch that I'm working on going vertically like this, because I'm going to be doing the buttonhole, the scalloped edge like this way. So I always like to turn my hoop so that the one I'm working on, this stitch is facing up. And I'm going to come up just at the very end of that stitch. And then just as I did before, I'm going to sort of press on the back and I'm going to put the needle underneath that straight stitch. And then I'm going to make sure that my thread is looped like this. I do not want it to be up here because then I'm not going to put the needle through this loop. I want it to be like this. I mean, you can also, you know, it's a little bit hard. That's why I don't do it. It's so hard to always, especially when they're stitching right here, to get this needle right underneath. You know, some people like to do it like that, but that just takes a lot of time and it's really, frankly, harder. But anyway, that one's like that. So I'm going to pull it, and I always pull the thread that way, flat against the fabric, and I'm going to snug it up like that and make sure that that stitch is right up at the top of this vertical straight stitch. And so now I'm going to do that again. I'm going to go underneath that stitch, make sure that this loop goes down here, and I'm going to come up inside that loop. Same thing, I'm going to pull the thread so that that stitch is, you know, on that end of the straight stitch. I'm going to pull it, and this time I'm not going to pull it quite so tight because I don't want every stitch to be, I mean, these are little tiny scallops we're making, and I want to have them give them just a little bit of a curved shape. And if every stitch is super tight, they're just going to be like a really, really tight row up against that straight stitch. So I'm going to try to see if I can get 4 to 5 stitches, and if I do 5, I'm going to try to make the third stitch to be the loosest so that it is like the top of the curve. So I'm going to pull on it, but I'm not going to pull as tight. So that's the third stitch. I'm going to go underneath my straight stitch again, come up inside the loop. This time I'm going to pull it a little tighter, just a little bit. We're not talking a lot here. That's number 4, and now I'm going to make the very last stitch. Come up in the loop, and I'm going to pull that one pretty tight. So I sort of have a little scallop right there. It's a tiny one. And now I'm going to take the needle down behind at the end, but a little bit behind. I don't want to come like down in the center because that kind of pulls that scallop forward, and I want it to lay flat. So I'm going to sort of pull it up with the thread and then go down behind it, the very end, and that will anchor that scallop. So there's the first one. Now I'm going to turn my hoop and I'm going to work on this next one. I've rotated my hoop and now this stitch is the next one. So it's facing vertically, straight up and down. I'll do the same thing and I'll bring the needle up at the very end. Hold that thread across this way. Now I'm on the edge, it's a little bit easier. I can manipulate this thread a little bit easier when it's not right out in the middle of the hoop. I'm going to come under the straight stitch and over that one or inside the loop. Pull that one pretty tight so it's way up at the top of that straight stitch. This is stitch number 2, making sure that it's pushed up against the first stitch. Here's number 3. Trying to make it a little bit looser. Number 4, make it a little bit tighter. And then just see if I can sneak in number 5, which is going to be pretty tight. And then take the needle down the very end, but just behind that scallop. There's my second scallop. Now this one, this third one, this little straight stitch was the one that ended up being kind of small. So let me see how many buttonhole stitches I'm going to get in that one. All right, this is my short stitch. I'm going to guess I'm going to try to get 4 in there. So I'm going to really make sure that one's up at the top. 2. Here's 3. This will be the last one. I just don't think I can get 5 because that stitch was just too short. So there's 4. And you can you don't want to manipulate these too much. I mean, you can kind of get them wonky, but you can push them up a little bit if you need to. All right, so there, that little scallop is shorter, but that's okay. All right, so just continue around and do this one, and then you'll have a complete ring of blue scallops. I got so excited about doing the blue scallops that I forgot that I needed to outline the edge of this flower. And of course, it doesn't matter what order you do these two things in. You could do this at the very end if you wanted to. But anyway, I'm just going to go ahead and do it now. And this is, I'm using 3 strands of the same old DMC and the split back stitch. So in case you hadn't noticed, this is one of my favorite stitches, especially for when I need, tight curves or a very compact line and a pretty smooth line. And like I think I mentioned before, I like it because it looks like a little bitty tiny chain stitch. But just as always, as in any place, the main thing to keep in mind here is that because these are small curves, I'm going to keep my stitches very small. So, there's not a lot of rules in embroidery. I don't like to feel like there's always all these rules. But one thing that does seem to hold true is the smaller the curve, the shorter the stitch. So these are pretty tiny. In fact, those are probably tinier than all the other ones I've done. It didn't have to be quite that tiny. I'm going to put my last one in. Catching on that knot in the back. There we go. And there's the outline. My original plan for the centers of these flowers was to use fluorescent yarn, fluorescent pink yarn. And it was going to be really cool. But, that was another thing that just didn't work out. These little circles are just too small and the yarn was too bulky and it just didn't look right. So if you can't use yarn, what's the next best thing? Beads, obviously. And I love these pink beads. And I'm going to show you a little trick I just learned for how to make it easier to pick up each bead. So what I've done here is this is just masking tape, sticky masking tape, and I made a circle that fits onto my finger. It's not sticky on the outside. My finger just slides right in. When I'm not using it, I just stick it on the side of my bowl like that, and then I can just slide my finger in. And then when I need to pick up some beads, those got right on the edge. You just stick some beads onto this masking tape. Now this masking tape is really sticky. There's painter's tape that doesn't have quite as much stick, and Scotch tape I don't think would work. You need this kind of thick, really, really sticky masking tape. And I'm not even going to use that many beads, so I could take a couple of those off. But they're stuck on there pretty good, but it'll hold them while you are stitching. So let me show you what I mean. Let me zoom back in a little bit. All right, so now I've got my finger with my beads ready to go. I'm going to come up in the center. I'm using one strand. And now when it's time to use a bead, all I need to do is just put the point of the needle in there like that, and then just unstick it. And it's right there. How easy is that? I mean, it's super simple to, pick them up out of the bowl, but you got to go back and forth every time. And this is just so convenient. The tape is sticky enough to keep them there, and so I'm ready for my next bead. I've come up, put the end of the needle, and just pop it off. And all I'm going to do is just fill in this center with beads. I put one in the center to begin with, and now I'm just going to go around the outside edge and get as many beads in there that fit comfortably. And I don't want them piled on top of each other, but I do want them to just fit in there like little puzzle pieces. And we're not putting that many beads in here, but that tape trick is really convenient. On the small flower, I got 3 beads in the center, and these big ones can hold about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 7. Although I'm not getting these as close together as I got them on the other flower. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, I think I can get 2 more in there. And then one more. There it is. Fits just perfectly. All right, let's do the stems now. The stitches for the stems are nothing new. It's stitches we've already done before. The main stem is out of the dark green, and it's couched. It's 6 strands of the dark green couched with 1 strand of the same color. So those are the main stems. And then for all these little leaves, I'm just doing the daisy stitch in just random selection, just a random placement of the light green and the medium green. The only thing that I'm doing maybe slightly different on these is the little stitch at the end. I'm making it a little bit longer to give that leaf a little bit more of a point. But other than that, it's just the same old daisy stitch that we have been using for other things. But when I put that down, I'm just going to make that stitch a teeny bit longer. Then I can hop down here and do this last one. Okay, and now there's just one last thing we need to do to finish up these stems. I want to fill inside the with some color the inside of these little daisy stitches. But to be a little bit different, I'm going to fill these with the orangey yellows and pinks that we've already been using. So instead of defaulting to my usual blue or green, I'm going to just randomly stitch. I've got 3 strands here, not really paying any attention to the placement. And then I have the dark pink. Just a simple straight stitch. Come up at the top, maybe that's easier. So nothing difficult, just kind of fun because it's pink and yellows instead of blues or greens. So just hop around, fill each one of those with a different color, whichever one strikes your fancy. And then these stems will be all finished.